Merry me, Annie here. I am doing a tag video. This one intrigued me. I couldn't wait to do it. I'll link you below to the fabled phoenix who put his questions and answers up on this particular tag. I don't know if it's anywhere else yet. I haven't seen it, but I really do like it. I'd suggest you stop by his channel. He is new to bringing videos to us, and he has a lot to offer our community. Special friend of mine. Somebody I am so proud that if you haven't met him, to introduce you to. So stop by and say hi. The tag is, what was your first? It's all about our first experiences along our path. We'll have a lot of things in common and a lot of things different in the way we experienced our firsts. For me, I'm going to admit right up front, when it comes to paganism, witchcraft, Wicca, goddess spirituality, that aspect of my path, I have to remember back when it comes to firsts to over 40 years. And I have problems remembering yesterday. So let's see how I do. I will put the questions also in the text box for this video so you have them in front of you. It would be great if you could do this too. What will be interesting is we will all have very different answers to this. How did you encounter paganism, witchcraft, or magic for the first time? Magic, I think I encountered it my entire life, specifically because my grandfather was a magic man. He would have known the term magic. He would not like to have been called a witch. He was a fine Baptist man, thank you very much. But he was born in Ireland, and he brought with him to this world and to his granddaughter a love of nature and the ability to feel its energies around us. And he was very respectful of and delighted by anything to do with the Fae. So I learned a lot about magic at his hand. Not about how to work magic or manifest anything out of it, but a matter of being aware of the magic in the world. When it comes to encountering paganism and witchcraft, well, paganism, if we look at the wider explanation of what that means, when I was in my teens, we moved to an area of the country where I had the opportunity to meet people from many different religious paths. So I met Hindus and Native Americans and practitioners of Eastern religions that under that wide umbrella are considered to be pagan. Maybe not what we think of as pagan in this specific community that you and I are part of, but pagan in the sense of other explorations of what God might be and what religion and spirituality might be. My encounter with paganism, as we kind of know it here in our community, starts off with a bit of a sad story. I was very young when I was married the first time, and it was an extremely violent and abusive marriage, which ended very quickly. But when it ended, I was in the hospital for a couple of months recovering from what happened in the process. Came out and had the great luck to be mentored and guided by a wonderful therapist who introduced me to a group of women. He didn't know what those women did. He just knew that women who joined them found healing there. I met my first group of women honoring goddess in their lives. Probably not, they wouldn't have considered themselves to be pagan. They didn't even call themselves witches. There were women from all paths, all walks of life, all religions, who connected to some aspect of the feminine divine. And I was with them for a couple of years, and actually, yes, it did save my life. When I got to a point where I realized I personally was being constricted by this goddess-only, goddess-centered spirituality, I left their group and moved on into, at that point I didn't know what, but very quickly I met my first traditional Wiccans and was taken in by them. That I think would qualify as my first encounter with paganism and witchcraft. By the ways we know it now, I would say. What was your first book? trying to think what the first ones would have been. Probably, which one came first? I don't know. The White Goddess or Aradia, the Gospel of the Witches. One of those two would have been the first ones. I almost think I remember the poetry of the White Goddess, so probably that one. When it comes to my first book that was more of a contemporary witchy kind of book, it was either one of Sybil Leek's books or I'm thinking maybe latest Sabrina's book, The Book of Shadows. She's been popping up a lot in my recollections and conversations this past week for some reason. What was the first spell you ever performed? The first spells I performed would have been spells in the group. There wouldn't have been things done outside of that. The kind of energy work that I was doing in that first circle with the women, and even the ones I was doing as I began my time in a formal Wiccan coven, were done in group, all together. And trying to remember what the first one was. I think I only remember what the first ones were because they were particularly emotional ones for me. They were two that I remember very specific. Healing work, and then work done when someone passed over. So I remember those things being done in group. Yeah, I'll stick with that. Obviously, there was lots of other things that happened later, but when and the thing is, there probably were other things that were going on 40 years ago when it came to spell work, but I think I can only remember the ones I stayed emotionally connected to. And I'd say healing and then work done in one particular instance of someone who had passed over. What was your first crystal or stone? I think my absolute first was a bloodstone. To this day, I am attached, very attached to that stone. I actually didn't own a crystal until Sophia came into my life. I think you'll all know Sophia from past videos. She's never far from me, not when I'm in this room. And I've only had Sophia for, I don't think I've had her 10 years yet. So crystals were very late coming in to my life. I was more working with stone, kind of stones. What was the first god and or goddess you encountered on your path? I would have to say, before my path was anything pagan, Mary made herself very present to me as something other than this shows up at the Nativity once a year kind of Mary, which is the only way she showed up in the Lutheran church I was raised with. So some sense, which became stronger over time, that Mary meant something more personal and deeper and wider than that. I had that feeling even as a teenager. The first god and goddess I encountered in a very tangible and real way. I felt goddess in the women around me and in me in that first women's circle very powerfully. But to actually experience God and goddess as their own distinct, separate presence, that would be how I came to know them as the god and the goddess of Wicca in my first traditional Wiccan group. How did you first meet other pagans? Well, I think I gave you that history, going from the hospital into that first women's circle, and then with only a little bit of a time alone, going into my first traditional Wiccan circle. As far as meeting pagans in the greater sense, that didn't really start happening until into the 80s for me. I was very cloistered before then. The people in your coven and the people in the covens that were part of that network that you were part of, but as far as meeting some wider group of pagans, not so much. So my first meeting of other pagans, those first two circles. What was the first festival, meetup, or public gathering you attended? You know, this one's a tricky one. I didn't participate. I won't say there weren't, but I didn't participate in public gatherings pretty much in the 70s. Mostly because my coven was 2 hours away. And I was there twice a week at a minimum. So 4-hour drive, round trip, at least twice a week for everything from my year and a day, my studies, the outer circle work, my initiation, my being present in the inner court, my elevation, and my leading of that coven as time went by. Gotta tell you the truth, there wasn't time for anything else. The only time that there were anything beyond that was when the wider network of aligned covens would come together for celebrations. But late in the 70s, for several years, I traveled to New York City to a Beltane gathering in Central Park. And I cannot remember for sure. My brain tells me it was called Beltane in the Park. But it's not the Beltane in the Park that was like from the 80s on. It was very small. Not as many people. It wasn't an art fair. It wasn't necessarily a music kind of thing, or it was just raw, pure, unadulterated Beltane. Very earthy, it's very sensual, very experiential, very... Let's just say that people from a lot of different paths. I remember there were Fellowship of Isis, there were the traditional witches, like myself, Fellowship of Isis, there were Golden Dawn and Thelemic people, there were, oh man, there were radical fairies. Does anybody know whatever happened to the radical fairies? They were such an important part of those years for me, and if it weren't for them, I swear I never would have understood the ecstasy and the poetry and the spiritual motion possible. And I always wondered, you know, did they fade away? I guess they did. Not that I don't know some friends who would say, oh yeah, I'm a radical fairy, but no, this was the organization. And basically we all came together with the same passionate embrace and or the physical embrace of the rut, the power of Beltane. I don't mean that the later Beltane in the Park didn't honor Beltane, but this earlier experience, I think I probably went like 3 or 4 years. Oh, some of the most glorious times I've ever had. Other than that, I don't do a lot of, never have done, a lot of public festival kind of things. What was the first class or workshop you took? Somewhere. Because I was so busy with cloistered work, there wasn't out there going to classes or workshops. I do remember when the Starhawkian kind of circle started making the rounds. Would that have been the late 70s? Definitely went to something that Starhawk did, something that Z Budapest did. I don't remember which I went to of first, but I can tell you of that early group of public workshops I went to, the one that moved me the most was one that Shekinah Mountain Water did. I remember that. It was before, was it before Ariadne's thread came out? Because she was, seems to me that it was in the works because of what she was like introducing and like testing and seeing how it went. But I don't know if that's for sure or not. What was the first chant you learned? No chanting in that first circle that I was part of. There was a lot of singing, but it was singing of everything from hymns to folk songs. I wouldn't call it chanting. In my first traditional circle, chanting. The witch's rune, if you would count that, that's how we raised energy. And also the use of the repetition of Iowa Evohe to raise energy to truly ecstatic release. There weren't any other chanting in that time. Now, where I made up for lost time is after my time with that traditional circle. And I started becoming involved with freeform circles, most Wiccan inspired, but not specifically Wiccan. Chanting became a big thing. And I loved chanting. I still have a collection of about 500 or so chants from over the years. Yeah, I still remember that. I do remember maybe with that first women's circle by the waters of Babylon, a feminized version of that may be considered a chant. Love chanting really wasn't a part of too much of my early, probably first 15 years or so of practice. What was the first method of divination that you learned? The first one was probably the flame and smoke. The augury using the smoke off of a candle or incense. I think that was probably the first one. What was your first tool? It took me a while to have a tool of my own. We had no tools in that first women's group. The tool would have been our body. Our body only, nothing else was used. Well, obviously, there were tools involved in my traditional Wiccan group in the years I was a part of that. They were often shared tools, like nobody had their own chalice. One chalice was shared. Until I was elevated to priestess, I didn't have my own blade, because the blade that was the blade for the circle, a sword, was the one that was shared and used together. So there weren't specific personal tools. So if I stop and think about then, I did get my own blade when I took my second, I think. The one I still have. But first tool, my first tarot deck would count, wouldn't it? So that would have been very early on. And also, I think I have something I would consider my first tool in that kind of working with energy sense. I still have it. In my first, the traditional Wiccan group that I was with for a period of time, I was, imagine this if you will, in my 20s, flowing hair to my waist, pert breasts, just, you know, the ultimate of young womanhood. I was the Coven Maiden. I loved my maiden time, and in fact, I love now that I feel I'm right back in that same place. You know, you don't always move on to cronehood. Sometimes you revisit those days of being the glorious maiden. And in that time, I was gifted with my own smudge wand to use when blessing the circle. And I still have it. I don't use it though, because she is a little bit rickety and falling apart. It's a turkey feather, and in those days you didn't have to worry about things like feathers. Whether you found them or had an animal that you had shed it, you could pick up feathers and no problem. I don't use her, as you can see. She's a beauty. But if I were to wave her in front of you, you'd see little pieces of her flying through the air. So she has a place of honor, but she is no longer in service. I'd say somewhere between the tarot deck that I first had, which was the 1910 Rider-Waite deck, and the smudge, the feather. What was the first method or exercise you learned for energy work? I'm going to say dancing. Dancing was probably the most common way, both in that first women's circle and then moving into a traditional Wiccan circle, movement and dancing. Because the first methods of raising energy would have been while I was doing outer court work yet. And definitely movement and energy would be the answer to that one. Let's see, what is... Oh, and Lucky 13, the last one. What is a memorable or favorite first on your path that wasn't included in the above questions? I'm going to say that it was the first time that after my first, when I was initiated and taken into the inner circle for that traditional group that I was part of for almost 13 years, the first time that I sat at the feet, all of us down, and our priestess standing, and our priest kneeling before her, I'm going to start to cry. Okay, sorry about this. And I knew, I felt it, I knew it, it was as real as it could possibly be when she drew Goddess down. And then she gifted us with that. I still remember that feeling of something coming down and then coming out. And it would go back into her and she made an offering of it. Oh, I still remember the shivers of that. That was long before I ever thought I'd be the person in that position to bring her down and share her with my circle. But I still remember the first time. It was powerful for two reasons. The experience of Goddess coming down and through, and also because I loved my priestess so much. The feeling of opening up to her and what she was bringing to us, knowing that she was this channel and that she was truly in a way sacrificing herself to us, to the circle, for this to happen. It was this overwhelming experience of love for the Goddess, awestruck by that swoosh of energy that came down and into the circle, and also just overwhelming respect and affection for this wonderful woman who was my priestess, who's now, of course, not any longer part of this world. She's off doing what she does elsewhere now, still probably as wonderful as she ever was. There wasn't a time to this very day, working in a group or working solitary, that I haven't been the one who invited Goddess to become one with me. That I didn't remember. Like that, you seekers in my classes know I talk about simultaneous holding. When that happens to me, I always feel that young woman that was me at my own feet looking up in wonder as it's happening. Yeah, that would be memorable. The first time I felt that, the overwhelming reaction I had to it. And the cool thing about it is, I still feel that same thing to this very day. I hope you've enjoyed this. And I hope I see a lot of these, as much because all of our firsts are going to be very different and very powerful. Capturing these important moments, these sparks of inspiration and experience and spirituality and energy that are part of our paths. And a lot of you probably will remember yours easier and more quickly than I did. You don't have to remember back quite so far. And please do check out Phoenix's channel. Stop by. Say hi. Introduce yourself, if you will. I wish you all mirth and reverence. Mary Part.